everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, October 30th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And this is my last episode that I have pre-recorded the intro for, as I've been off traveling and sort of not near any of my recording equipment. So I will be back next week in November, recording the next sort of intro for the show. For this week, I am excited to present to you Dr. Jenni Nuttall. She is an academic who's been teaching and researching medieval literature at the University of Oxford for the last 20 years. She is deep in old words, and she has a new book for us, actually her first sort of book for public reading. She's done a lot of academic work in the past, and it's called Mother Tongue: The Surprising History of Women's Words. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Jenni Nuttall. Well, Jenni, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for inviting me on.
Absolutely. So we are going to be speaking about your newest book, which is also your first kind of trade publication, your first book for a general audience, Mother Tongue: The Surprising History of Women's Words. So you, of course, are, you're an academic. You focus on medieval literature, which I guess to me, it sounds very far away from my world, but I'm assuming that it's probably a pretty big topic of inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very sort of flourishing field, medieval studies and medievalism, both in terms of the history of English literature and what's called kind of global medieval studies, what's going on around the world at that part of time. And yeah, I teach in Oxford, and on the Oxford English course, it's kind of unique selling point as an undergraduate course is that you start at the beginning. You start with Old English literature written in the Anglo-Saxon period, and you also study medieval literature, and you go all the way through to the present date. So I get to teach an awful lot of this kind of literature and language that, yeah, seems way back in the past, but it's kept alive in Oxford.
Interesting. And of course, it's not actually the beginning, but I think for a lot of English speakers, it feels like it might be the beginning. Yeah.
Yes, I suppose I'm thinking of it in terms of the beginning of the language being called English and being one of the languages brought to the British Isles by incomers and immigrants, and it's a language that ends up for a while at least being the kind of vernacular, the kind of language in which lots of things are kind of done in the Old English period.
Can you help us understand, because I feel like I've spoken about this before on the show, the difference between sort of Old English and Middle English, like maybe utilizing some things that we've read before and kind of where they net out in the timeline?
So Old English, you might think of Beowulf, that might be something people have come across, and Old English riddles, and sort of elegies like The Wanderer, poems like The Dream of the Rood, written before the Norman conquest in 1066, which produces a lot of change. And it's not like everything kind of suddenly changes at that moment. There's a kind of overlapping period, but then you could say that English for a century or two takes a kind of back seat for a while in terms of kind of public writing and public discourse and record keeping, and then it sort of comes back again, rises in prominence in the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries, and then you're in what we call Middle English. So that's the stuff that Chaucer is written in around the year 1400, and then that gradually becomes what's called Early Modern English, as we're heading towards the time of Shakespeare, and it's never that suddenly it all sounds different one day. It's a whole series of kind of gradual changes of grammar and pronunciation and vocabulary. But that's the kind of period I'm interested in the book, going back to the kind of the origins of quite a lot of the kind of discussions and words that we use for women's lives and bodies and experience, and seeing what they look like in these early versions of English that are very familiar to me as someone who teaches that literature and language, but might be a bit more surprising to people who haven't kind of explored quite so much. And I wanted to kind of bring that across for the general reader.
What defines Old English in terms of, is it just a time period, or is it like certain grammar distinctions or spellings? Or, I mean, I'm assuming that there are a lot of different components to it, but how do you determine if something is old versus middle?
I guess mostly to do with kind of when it's written, um, sort of pre or post conquest. But there are features of language, so features of pronunciation that are changing as you move from Old English to Medieval English. Vocabulary is changing, and actually the system of grammar is changing. So mostly in English, we use kind of word order to kind of communicate the grammar of what we want. There are changing endings on verbs, and things like pronouns we would recognize. We've got he and him and himself. So we have got kind of different forms of a word in modern English. But in Old English, you have lots more of those different forms. So when my students are learning to read Old English for their exams in Oxford in the first year, they're having to learn a lot more about this earlier phase of English grammar, where it's the form of the noun or the adjective, as well as the form of the verb, that are kind of and other parts of the language that are kind of telling you what's going on in a sentence. So it improves their English grammar if they haven't learnt much in school.
Yeah, a little refresher course and then some. And spellings are quite different as well, right? Even if they're like the actual letters that were used were a bit different.
Yeah, a little bit. So there's a couple of things that start off as runes and then are used in Old English for certain sounds. So there's a thing like looks like a P, but with the lobe of the P kind of drop down towards the middle, and that's called a thorn, and yog and ash. So yeah, it can look a little unfamiliar, and you can think of a word like Haneka, Hnecca, eventually over time becomes our modern word neck, Neck. So you can see that there's a kind of, you can see the connection, but sometimes it looks rather alien in the spelling.
Yeah, it's so fascinating that for those of us for whom English is our first language, we're talking about the same language, just in earlier form, but in some cases it can really feel quite foreign.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's vocabulary. That's what I found interesting in the book. There are some words that I mean, they change and the spelling changes and the pronunciation changes, but they do come all the way down to the present day. And then there are lots of words that don't, but were once very current. And so some of the book is looking at the backstories of the words that come all the way to us, and some of the book is looking at what are the words that were current part of the kind of spoken and written parts of English of earlier periods that for one reason or another kind of drop out of use, and they're not properly lost. We can still go and find them if we want them in dictionaries and in the written record, but they're lost in the sense that they wouldn't necessarily be kind of recognizable, or something that a modern speaker of English would say, yeah, I know that word.
So I'm super curious because, of course, we don't often think about, I guess, feminist language, feminist literature when we're thinking about a time period that's so far away. I think there's sort of, I've been reading, and I've mentioned this on the show before because I had her on the show to talk about it, Angela Saini's new book, The Patriarchs, and really this deep dive into sort of like, when did patriarchy begin, and have there been sort of not really matriarchal, but maybe matrilineal societies, and sort of when did we start to see that shift? And there's so much kind of controversy even within different scholars. And when we think about sort of this period, the Middle Ages, we definitely don't think of it as like a women's rights kind of era. And so I'm definitely curious, as a pretty hardcore feminist myself and somebody who is super interested in this topic, where did this idea even come from to write about sort of, I guess, feminist language in Old English?
Yeah, and I suppose the subtitle of the book is slightly different. Is women's words.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I was interested in vocabularies which were used then and the vocabularies we have now to talk about um, many aspects of women and their lives and their experiences of their own bodies, of work, of um, family of the home, all those sorts of things across the period. I suppose feminist in the sense that I thought it was important to unpack the backstories of some of the words we use, and I think lots of feminist scholarship has often done this. Have tried to show how the kind of ideology of a society that subordinates and limits women kind of transmits its logic not only through its laws and its cultures and its customs, but they get embedded in its language. I was also, I mean, it's often called proto-feminism, and you're right that people argue about kind of, is it, can we really think of it as kind of feminism in our terms? But I was particularly interested in looking for words and discussions of language which showed um, women and quite a lot of male experts and authorities too, sort of pushing back against some of the logic that kind of props up patriarchy. And that's sort of where the idea came from. That I read a lot of sort of the history of X, and it skates over lots and lots of centuries, the centuries I study and I teach, to kind of start telling you about the kind of really serious stuff that happened in the 18th and 19th, 20th century. And I thought, well, maybe it's time to really go back and look for the first kind of faint um, traces of the words and the thinking which will provide the kind of foundations for later feminism, I think.
Yeah, I love that so much. And I'm so curious and fascinated just by this idea. So, where do we even begin, really? Like, how did you begin in organizing your thoughts to write a book about this?
Um, yeah, as you often do with non-fiction books, you write one chapter first, or two or three chapters that you're going to kind of use to see whether this is a viable project. And I actually started with the language of menstruation, the set of vocabulary for discussing that experience. Partly because it was what I was talking to my then sort of young teenage daughter about.
Ah.
She stomped through the door one day and she said, "Period is a really boring word." And I thought, yeah, it really is. It just gives you a sense of time. It doesn't really capture some of the kind of physiological business of it. And she and I often kind of play with words and talk about words. And I said, I bet it's not the first word. And I didn't really know what the earlier words were, but I went and looked them up and could see that period was something that had come along rather later in the history of English. And there were lots of earlier words, flux and runnings and issues and sheddings and courses and terms and flowers, say. So I suddenly thought, okay, that there's something in this because it allows us. I'm not really seriously proposing we kind of take back all these old words and kind of, I don't, I'm a realist, that's not going to happen. But what they give us are lots of alternative conceptualizations for something. It's like having a kind of historical thesaurus to dive into, and just think about, why do we call them this? What are the kind of implications of that? So I wrote that chapter, and I remember thinking, if I can do this for the language of menstruation, probably the rest of the book is going to kind of work out. And then I sort of worked out what I wanted to put in the chapters, which was, part of the book to do with female anatomy and things like menstruation, pregnancy, birth, infertility, all sorts of things like that. But very much also chapters on women's working lives and words for women at different stages of their life. And I began to see that it was a way of giving kind of micro histories of some of these topics. It might be almost a kind of a different way to package up some of the really excellent feminist scholarship that's happened over the last kind of 20, 30 years, and kind of get it out there and say, some of the things you think you might know about words and concepts like witch or hysteria or menstruation in the past. If we kind of follow the stories of the words, we can see that things are a bit more kind of nuanced and interesting and kind of varying across history. So I sort of sorted everything into different chapters and then had quite an intense process of doing a lot of research for each chapter and then trying to write something that was really kind of accessible and funny and would kind of move you through time without it seeming too much like a whole series of kind of lectures.
I'm so grateful that you are offering this important scholarship in a really readable way, but B, just fascinated by some of these concepts. And I'm really excited over this hour to uncover maybe some of those misconceptions that many of us might have. But I have to ask, and I don't want to call it like a chicken and an egg situation, but there's sort of so much context that's required when you are looking at, language. You're looking at language within a cross section of time. And let's say, for example, the one that you came up with, menstruation, right? A period. Looking at Old English and the words that were used, and you kind of rattled off this list, some of which were quite flowery and beautiful, some of which were almost I don't know, like you said, shedding, which to me is just a fascinating word because it almost assumes a certain amount of scientific knowledge. I'm just curious how much of your research involved figuring out what the state of knowledge was at the time. What did we know scientifically, or what was the prevailing kind of ideology or viewpoint? Because that is necessary to understand what the language was implying, right?
Yeah, and absolutely. And that's one of the ways in which this book is not simply, I mean, sometimes it is women speaking or writing in their own voices about these all sorts of topics, but it's also women's words in the sense that, what counts as kind of male authority and knowledge and expertise in various fields across the course of history are saying about women. And I think you've got it exactly right that one of the reasons it's interesting to look at all of these different terms of vocabulary is we can see moments, for example, where menstruation is no longer being described as simply something kind of shameful or, sort of something that should be kind of outside of discourse, and is, for example, being discussed by medical writers. So even around the year 1000 in Old English medical texts, there are certain cures for certain sorts of gynecological complaints, and you get put into words or recorded, as it were, these words that must have been used for English, and they can be rather physiological, kind of flowing, fluser, things like that. And a little later into the Middle Ages, as people are starting to produce English versions of Latin medical and scientific texts, they need to kind of put this technical language of science and medicine, what passes as science and medicine, into the vernacular, and they tend to come up with the words that sometimes you get what looks like just the kind of word of the male expert, but given that these translations are often opening this material out to a broader audience, you quite often get a synonym or a gloss or a kind of extra word, and you can see menstruation being very much discussed as part of kind of bodily regulation and health, purgation and shedding issues. Writers are careful to note that it is a kind of flux, a kind of letting out of blood from the body, but it's not a dangerous one like other kinds of diseases. And flowers, again, tells us something, because the historians of medicine suggest that flowers is used in the vernacular, that is a kind of euphemism, but because it shows an understanding that regular menstruation is needed for fertility. So just as you need flowers on a fruit tree, which then set fruit, and then you get kind of apples or pears or whatever, flowers and pregnancy have a connection. So you're right that each of these items of vocabulary needs a kind of frame to kind of explain it, but the framing of it is this great way, I think, of kind of getting a grasp on thinking. You can go from the word to a context, and then from the context back to the word, I hope.
Yeah. And I'm curious, as you're looking at these sort of original texts, and I can assume that they come from so many different places, from official kind of documents that were published, for a wider audience to read, to correspondence, to sort of like tax records and things of that nature. I mean, this is kind of an impossible question to answer, so I don't need obviously a precise number, but like what percentage or like how much of this text would you say was written by men versus women when you're really doing your digging? Is the vast majority of what you were studying these sources written by men?
Yeah, the vast majority. And I think, that might give us a choice. You could turn away from all of that material and think, right, that's not going to tell us anything. But then there are definitely, some, and there's been great work to kind of show how much material there is written by women. But of the overall total, not a huge amount, and certainly, less of women writing as kind of experts and authorities. But they are, much more than you might assume there as a kind of audience for some of this material, especially when medical and scientific and kind of philosophical, theological knowledge is being put into the vernacular. And that happens, from the Middle Ages onwards. It's clear that there's a kind of need for this, whether it's because men's Latin is not really good enough, or there are women who will want to read it. I sort of think about these texts and their readership, and sometimes claiming a female audience is a kind of way of explaining or kind of justifying why you're writing in English, whether it's actually true or not. But I think lots of early dictionaries in the Renaissance say that they may be particularly useful for kind of women readers. So I was sort of always it. Yes, I didn't want to give up at the point. I thought, well, that there's not going to be a kind of is there some way to go back and kind of reliably find the language women are talking every day about these subjects in? Possibly not, but I think you will find something approximating it in the synonyms and the glosses and the kind of explanations of some of this terms. And women are not sort of kept completely out of this kind of scientific and expert discussion. And I have lots of examples in the book where you see sort of practical first-hand knowledge coming up against kind of theoretical models, and kind of what happens when those two things meet.
So when you did find, well, maybe before we get to the times where you actually did find kind of first source material from women themselves, generally speaking, when you're looking at this time period, what is the, I guess how do I even put this? What are the attitudes towards women? I mean, is it sort of like it is today? Is it significantly worse? Is it like complicated? Like the language that you were looking at has to have been somewhat loaded. And so I'm curious kind of what the life of a general woman would have been. And maybe it was wildly different for rich and poor, for example.
Yeah, I mean that's what I'm thinking, is I'm wondering how I might kind of grapple with that question. Very, very different depending on class. If we're just thinking about the kind of the British Isles in these periods, I think it's easy to take the worst of our fears about how sexist the past was, say, all women are married and they're married very young, say. That seems like a kind of reasonable thing to think about the past. But if you look at where we have data, so the Middle Ages and through the 16th, 17th, 18th century, generally women, say, are marrying quite late in their mid to late 20s. Not everyone is getting married, for example. You might think, for example, that when you're married, you stop working outside the home in these periods. Well, that's not really borne out by the research, that actually, partly because there are these extended households with kind of servants and relatives, that married women often come to the fore in these kind of household economies and kind of join their husbands in trades. And then if the husband dies, they carry on. So one of the things I wanted to do in the book was show the variation over time, and that some of what we might assume, and particularly some of these sort of 18th and 19th century ideas that really get reinforced in those centuries about what a woman should be, and some of those kind of models of femininity, they're not deep. So, I mean, some of them are deep-rooted ideas, but there are a lot of things that kind of challenge those assumptions in the earlier periods. And what you also see a lot of is a kind of, on the one hand, theory. So this is how things should be in a kind of patriarchal society where the kind of gender binary works to suppress women. But then if you kind of look at historical research and you look at the evidence of the language, you see that the reality on the ground is not quite so limiting. There are all sorts of kind of workarounds and kind of shared or authority at times. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to be naive and say it was all brilliant. I mean, that's not certainly it, but it's certainly, for any of these topics, there's reasons to think, actually, perhaps that's not as kind of, not as misogynist, say, as I would expect it to be. You're right that all of these languages and the kind of structure of society do encode certain assumptions, but you can see a lot of kind of, but phases of misogyny are definitely challenged by other more progressive voices all the way through these periods. So just like our society today, it's not one thing, it's kind of voices countering each other.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine that. I don't know. It's such a hard thing to put ourselves into an era where we don't live. And I think it's very easy to maintain a sort of like supremacist mindset, this kind of like where we are today is where we were always headed. This like it's the problem I often see in evolutionary biology when there's and I'm not saying amongst experts, I'm saying amongst individuals who are like trying to understand the concept, that there's no intentionality to it. We're not where we are now because we've always been working towards this. It's just how we happen to be based on all of the different pressures. So when we look back in time, I think we have this like deep hindsight bias, like back then was leading to now, but really back then just was back then. And we were the same species. It's not like, it's 1,000 years ago. It's not like we've, evolved significantly since then. Like society has changed and people's mentalities may have changed, but it was happening within the same brain space as we possess today.
And you certain stereotypes and assumptions that are used to kind of limit women can slacken and harden over time. So you might think that women in some ways the connection of women and hysteria goes back a long way, but the first time hysterical, the adjective appears in English, it's not being used to kind of belittle a woman necessarily. It's being used in a more medical way to respond to an accusation of witchcraft, and the expert there wants to say, no, it's not that this particular victim has been bewitched, it's that they might be suffering from a particular kind of uterine problem. And that notion of hysteria doesn't really it kind of comes and goes, and it doesn't really get to its kind of final constricting, misogynist version that we recognize till rather later on, and it's an idea and a use of a word that's kind of changing. So yeah, I think it's I wanted to show how sort of how culturally specific and kind of culturally determined these words are. But then the funny thing is, it is often the case that the word kind of trundles along to the present day, kind of changing its reference, changing its connotations, kind of sometimes maybe even helping women out, sometimes definitely not helping them out. So you can kind of tell interesting stories.
Yeah. I'm curious about the word hysterical. I think that most of us at this point probably have some idea of that word, and we kind of understand that it does have a sexist sort of connotation. But I don't know if most people understand that the roots of like basically hyster, like hysterectomy, that just means uterus, right?
Yeah.
And so it really did start as a medical term.
Yes, and hysteria is a noun, as I understand it, isn't something that appears, say, in the sort of ancient Greek authorities that you might expect to find it in. That there is this kind of adjective that illnesses that are hysterical, uterine in some way, and it takes a certain sort of motivated reasoning at later points in history to kind of sometimes to really say, look, this is particularly connected to women, and it's offered up as a kind of pseudo logic for women's supposed inferiority. But there are points of time in the 17th, 18th century where people are saying, look, it can't be to do with the moving of the womb, because wombs are tethered by ligaments. They clearly don't move. That's clearly a kind of ridiculous idea from Plato that some people believe, but some people don't. And they're pointing out that there are symptoms that the exact same symptoms in men and women get different labels. So the kind of the gendered sexism of that word is being recognized at points in history. People are saying, hang on, actually, don't these things look rather similar? And why are we calling them different things? They're still hunting around for a kind of explanation to kind of pin it to in the body. But, and it's only in the sort of 19th century that idea really comes back very strongly, that this is very much to do with women, first of all, connected to their bodies. And when those explanations become less convincing, you get the Freudian psychology, where they say, oh, no, hysteria, there's a sort of particular psychology that somehow explains why women are supposedly susceptible to this. But you can see that it's kind of scurrying around the room like a rat, this idea. Every time someone challenges it, it kind of runs off and finds a new way to be useful, which shows you the kind of continuing need for these kind of medical scientific kind of sexist ideas that we're really still, I think there's been lots of great work on how we're really still trying to kind of throw off some of these ideas. But you shouldn't think that no one was kind of challenging or questioning those ideas earlier on, because there are lots of voices kind of saying, really, does that make sense? I don't think it does.
Right. I'm curious, you mentioned hysteria within the context of sort of witchcraft and almost like an alternative explanation. And so I'm curious, I think that we have a lot of lore around witchcraft. I think very few of us probably have a solid understanding of what the mentality of the time was, what, people actually believed and thought, and whether that was as deeply gendered as we believe it to be. And so I'm wondering if you could give me maybe a little bit of understanding of the era and some of the words that you came across that relate to those sorts of beliefs or explanations for behavior.
Yeah, and it's interesting that sort of early on, as it appears in English, witch can refer to somebody female or somebody male, and then becomes much more associated with the female. And you see words that start off simply meaning things like kind of old woman, or or things like hag or crone, or there's an honorific beldam, good lady, which becomes beldam in that kind of Shakespearean witches sense. So we can see that there is this connection between certainly in the imagination, the kind of figure of the witch emerges. But when you read through the kind of historical research on kind of what was going on in terms of who was accused and how often they were accused, different things are going on in different countries across Europe through the Middle Ages and the early modern period. And what might be true in certain bits of continental Europe or Scotland in certain moments is not true everywhere else. And I think there are some countries, Iceland, say, where it's more men that are being accused. So it is kind of, it's not that every woman who shows a bit of spirit or intelligence or rebellion is instantly kind of pointed at. And, it's, women are overrepresented, but it can be poor women, it can be neighbours who are doing well and people are jealous of. You can see things to do with kind of intergenerational conflict. And you also see that if you look at there are moments, these things that we recognize as the kind of witch finding crazes where often because of other social pressures you get kind of little spikes. But what you have, if you take a step back and look at the broader period, is really, not so many prosecutions. I mean, if you average them out, one or two accounts per county a year. This is a kind of rare old thing, and you get an awful lot of skepticism, even in the 16th century, that these accusations are groundless and that witchcraft is not a very kind of reliable framework. And so I think it's easy to fear the worst, as it were, and think, okay, that women are always at risk for this. But again, if you kind of go and read up on the kind of great research that's been done, you say, okay, it was there, but not perhaps to the degree that we might assume. And we can understand, if we look at kind of who was prosecuted and why and what happened to them, the conviction rates are not very high. There is a real kind of, something that you, I think, have worked on kind of the skeptical response that, and people are being very skeptical in legal, and worrying about false accusation and about the kind of snowball effect of some of these things. People are writing lots of, there are the very famous treaties setting out, making connections between women and witchcraft, but there are lots of authorities trying to write much more skeptical treaties and saying, I think this isn't right. We need to kind of think about whether this is a real, is witchcraft a real thing, or are we falling for a kind of myth? And you find that not just in kind of modern historiography, but kind of in text from the period too. So I had such fun writing this book, because every time I kind of landed on a word and thought, right, I need to give a really good account in 2 or 3 pages of kind of what's going on with the word hysteria or with the word witch. It was great to be able to kind of read all of that research and kind of summarize it as accurately and as kind of clearly as and accessibly as I could, and sort of say, look, learn about this word, but also maybe kind of freshen up some of your sense of kind of what's going on in different historical periods. Because I think some of those historical myths that came to us through the kind of early waves of feminism, for entirely understandable reasons, maybe need to be kind of modernized and nuanced a bit.
And I think along that kind of line, I'm super curious. I know before you sort of mentioned in a tongue-in-cheek way that you're a realist and you're not sort of advocating that all of these words be brought back into our vernacular, but I'm curious if there's anything specific that you came across in your research or anything that you highlight in this book where you're like, I think we should bring this back. Like, are there any words that just really spoke to you personally that you would love to sort of, I don't know, re-emerge into our regular vocabulary?
Well, I mean, partly having a teenage daughter and having kind of worked through those discussions that you have about kind of puberty and growing up and kind of, the unavoidable kind of bodily facts of life. It was very striking that she and I, if you think of the words we have to do that in, and I'm thinking here about kind of female sexual reproductive anatomy particularly, we've got lots of kind of very Latinate words: vulva, vagina, uterus, cervix, all of those sorts of things, and they're not hugely user friendly. They have that sense of taboo, that they're kind of words that you might not want to kind of use, although I think we're getting a lot better with that. And because their etymology is rather unclear, if you're not a Latinist, there's nothing to kind of help you. And I was rather delighted to find a lot of the kind of vernacular synonyms, kind of equivalent words that are being used as descriptions or names in English. So things like matrix or mother for the womb. There's a great Renaissance anatomy writer who's trying to kind of explain what the kind of new science of anatomy is kind of discovered about the human body. And in English, he uses words like port and passage and gate and engine, things like that. And they're kind of metaphors. But you think, well, that's, that even at that stage, there is a kind of vernacular, fairly simple, easily kind of understood set of words, and you realize that there are alternatives. So the labia, for example, there's a period in time where there's a set of alternatives like wings or lips, or a bit more classical nymphs. And I really, with that set of vocabulary, thought, I mean, I'm not so far, I'm too much, I don't think, yes, we could bring them back, but it did make me very strongly think, what if she and I were having these conversations without having either a kind of Latinate language, or I have to use euphemism, or I have to use slang. And that makes me, and I'm sort of, it's hard to kind of change, even well-intentioned attempts to change language really take a while to work, or any to kind of clean up or improve language. That can be a difficult process, but I, if I could wave a magic wand and have one thing, it would be that there were a set of vernacular but not slangy or obscene terms for those body parts.
I'm curious, when you were doing your research, you mentioned that the vast majority of the sort of authorship or of the perspective that you obviously were uncovering was male, which means that we were dealing with sort of a male gaze, a male kind of frame. What percent would you say was sort of authoritative? Like how much of what you were researching were documents that were written for the medical community, or for like a journalistic purposes, or kind of government documents, versus internal personal correspondence where you might have actually seen a lot of that sort of slang or that more colloquial speech coming through?
Yeah, I mean, just partly because I guess some of that more private correspondence, so if we're thinking about private letters, some has been edited and kind of put into the sort of circulation that will kind of bring it to the attention of people who make dictionaries, say. Some of it, a lot of it, not still. So kind of sitting in archives. There that if if you had the time, or if you're working on a particular kind of family or person or location, you can go and kind of read through the archives. But I think that, there probably is a lot more material there, which might give you synonyms, names for things that haven't yet made the dictionaries. I was more working with that kind of set of vocabulary that we already have kind of recorded.
Right. So it's more like codified language, and maybe a little bit more professional.
Like, if you think of a dictionary, say, you and particularly some of the if you look at the early multilingual dictionaries, so a dictionary of French to English, or Italian or Spanish to English, or Latin to English, for one head word, so for one term in Latin or French or English, they will often give you 4 or 5 synonyms in English. And you might guess that process of kind of listing those synonyms is capturing a kind of range of everyday English expressions for that. And therefore you might not have to go and find a kind of a letter or a poem, say. But I looked at, the book is fairly, I sort of let the words lead, and I would then go to dictionaries, and then I would search glossaries and corpora, so kind of sets of text that I could search to kind of find those words. And I let the words take me to all sorts of different sources. So there are lots of official sources, but there are also letters, poems by women, kind of all. I mean, one of the fun things of the book, I think, is that it's a kind of tour through lots of different types of historical sources, and sometimes you can kind of find interesting words where you wouldn't think to look through them, particularly when all sorts of works are being translated for a wider readership. I think that's where a lot of the words I'm interested in come from, again, because a technical, something that we might think of now as a technical term, whether it's from another language or a kind of newly, is being glossed and explained. And I think there's lots of those sorts of materials that are actually kind of bridging across the way you're asking that question. I'm interested in those sorts of formats, which take the kind of the official or the scientific or the kind of public or the expert and start to disseminate and disperse it and need to find some words to do that in. And then you get a bit of a kind of interchange between the higher formal registers and other registers.
I guess what I'm deeply curious about is, because you have done this scholarship and you've dug really deep into sort of women's words, right? This idea of the language that describes whether it be the feminine form or female kind of quote unquote behavior. But it's often, because history is written by men, because men were in power, especially at this period of time, through that sort of male gaze. I'm curious about any examples you may have come across wherein, I think of a term today like the word slut, which is a clearly loaded word that men use in order to make a determination or a description of women. And women have, obviously adopted that sort of sexist language. There's a lot of internal sexism as well. That's just what happens when culture is deeply shaped in this way. And then some women have taken it back, and said, yes, like I am an ethical slut, or that my sluticism is something that I'm proud of. But regardless, these words are kind of deeply intentional to sort of say, well, this is an action of women, and it takes the sort of onus off of men. Like we're not responsible because promiscuity is something that women do. And I'm curious if you just came across any words like that were like pejorative, or that were maybe even not intentionally pejorative, but that were deeply divisional, that then women eschewed or said, no, that's not the same word that we use to describe ourselves. That's a sexist term, and we don't want to be seen that way.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of the last part of your question, I think that perhaps is a somewhat more modern, that sense of kind of either refusing language or kind of transforming it. There's discussion, for example, of the term old maid, which yes, there's we can see a kind of sexist logic at work that's trying to say that women who live their lives without getting married, we don't simply describe them neutrally. We have a very kind of pejorative, and I talk in the book about the kind of moment in history where that description, it's to do with a whole set of kind of cultural and historical pressures. But you will see there's a poem written, this is also a period in which women are kind of writing, publishing poetry a bit more, and you can see women saying, I'm not frightened by the name old maid. And you can see writers saying, don't be, live your own life, don't be put off by it. And there's a discussion about whether unmarried women can have the kind of honorific term matron, which is sometimes applied more to kind of married women, but can also just indicate a woman with a certain sort of social status or authority. So yeah, there are moments where the choice between old maid or can you call a kind of single woman a matron, Slut is very interesting because, yes, it's used now in the way that you're talking about, with the kind of intentionality, and we see it connected very firmly to a kind of anti-women logic, but its accidental origins also tells you something. So it's a word for a very kind of lowly female servant to start with. You sometimes see in kind of records that if you're talking about the minimum number of servants you need for a house, you need a cook, slut, and a butler. And you think, my word, cook, slut, butler. This is an episode of Downton Abbey that I didn't really register.
Yeah.
Because slut there is sort of saying, is actually it's a word that has connotations early on of kind of grubbiness. Our word drudgery comes from the word drudge, which was another name for a kind of low paid female servant doing very unappealing jobs in kind of domestic settings. But the reason it kind of moves over to have its modern meaning is because those women are seen as sort of sexually available, and we might also say kind of sexually vulnerable because they're
Right.
kind
Yeah.
of
They
in
were easy to
household.
rape.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and you see similar things with words like wench, say, which has this kind of similar range of meanings. So you can kind of, if you track back to get these kind of backstories, you know, we know what's going on with it in its kind of modern phase, but its history is sort of, it gives you a kind of social explanation. Both it can give you both what we would see, that it's their kind of social economic vulnerability that make these kind of single young women in these households particularly vulnerable, and then the kind of ideological frame that's being put on it, that men don't blame themselves, they start to kind of blame these women. You get an overlap between words for kind of domestic servants and women who are thought to sell sex for a living similarly. So it's I'm interested with the idea of sort of, there is a kind of intentionality of doing it, but often the words are sort of letting on more than the kind of sexist users might want to kind of agree or accept in terms of explanation. And I found lots of words where you could kind of track not only a history of misogyny, but also something a bit, kind of what was going on around that. And sometimes that these words have a kind of truth-telling capacity. I thought that was sort of interesting to work with in the book.
I have to ask, because I can imagine that there are probably so many examples like slut. You just so beautifully kind of told the tale of this evolution of something that was like a pejorative term kind of about somebody's station that sort of evolved into this victim blaming that I think we see quite often, right? And we're seeing a shift now in our language. Prostitute, for example, you know, now at least where I live in Los Angeles, the police don't use the term prostitute nearly as often anymore. They've really moved into like a victim, like trafficking victim, and sort of started to shift the conversation to really better describe, or like even the word slave. We don't often use the word slave anymore. We say enslaved person because it shows the onus, right, of the like it takes the blame out of the individual. But I'm curious, did you see anything that turns that on its ear? Did you see any terms, or have you ever come across any language that was sort of empowering, where we've seen an evolution that took a sort of belittling or minimizing, and then there was like a new ownership or a new term? I think for myself, I'm somebody who's not married and I don't have children. I don't really believe in marriage. I don't want to get married. It's a choice. And I don't call myself childless. I call myself child free. You know, I have chosen, I'm free of children. I don't have to deal with children. And like, I find childless to be very pejorative, but I find child free to be like sort of an empowering and intentional term. And so I'm curious if you've come across anything like that in sort of medieval language, where women were using their words as a sort of a political tool, or as a tool of personal empowerment.
I think that's quite
Modern.
I'm sure that is there. It's quite hard to kind of find your way to that through the kind of sources we have. That I'm thinking, as you were talking there, about a proto-feminist, early feminist writer, people have heard of and thought about, Christine de Pizan, and one of the ways she frames one of her works called the Book of the City of Ladies is part of the beginning of that back is really her looking at her society's ideas of how women are described, the kind of worst edges of medieval misogyny, kind of women this, women that, and she sort of says, but she describes, what women do, all the kind of good things that women do in societies, and she just says to herself, can this be true? And I think that, we don't have very many discussions like that, but she's questioning, for example, the language around sexual assault in that book, and it comes into English. It's translated quite early on, so it's kind of there in English, and bit later on, as the some of those kind of early feminist voices are getting going, they start to talk a lot about custom, which doesn't sound a very interesting word to us, but the idea that these restrictions, these ways of thinking about women, these kind of labels that put on women are custom rather than natural, is a really kind of important moment where something kind of shifts, and that male subordination is tyranny. They borrow that word out of the kind of political sphere and start to kind of use it to talk about patriarchal limitations. So it's interesting to see those moments where women start to kind of grasp hold of the kind of parts of cultural thinking that are doing some of the work of patriarchy and say, I don't believe that anymore. And they don't really, it's very difficult to kind of turn everything up on its head and kind of find their way. It takes a long time to kind of start to do the things you're doing, which is kind of, finding words that really sort of break apart those expectations and allow you to kind of describe what you think and who you are in exactly your own terms. But I think my book is tracking some of the kind of first moves in that story, moments where women look and say, I don't believe that. There's a historian called Catherine Macaulay who says, the idea that nature intended one sex to be subordinate to the other, it is contradiction and absurdity. And I think, well, yeah, excellent. There's still a lot of kind of legal and social and cultural work to do, but I'm interested in those moments of kind of clarity like that.
Yeah, I'm just fascinated by this sort of shift. I guess we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Like I'm in a privileged position to be able to turn some of these things on their ear because I am, able to support myself, and I live in a culture and a society wherein it is still deeply problematic and deeply patriarchal. But I am empowered to do things that a lot of women in sort of the Middle Ages obviously were not empowered to do, and so I'm super curious about sort of the whisperings of women, right? The inner worlds and the experiences that women had when they were free from the male gaze, or when they were free to imagine or fantasize about what the world could look like, a more just world could look like. And I'm always fascinated by the question of whether women of this era had so much internalized sexism that they saw themselves through the male gaze, or whether women were constantly in that complicated place where they were like, well, they say it's supposed to be like this, but I don't feel like it's like this.
I think there's a bit more of the latter, and you can see, I mean, even in fiction. So Chaucer's Wife of Bath, there's a fiction. She's not real. She's Chaucer's kind of entertaining evocation of what a kind of woman like that might say and think. But she's kind of thinking in all sorts of ways outside of the kind of standard models. Now she's sort of being made fun of, and she's being produced for entertainment. But there is this. This kind of possibility of challenge. I think it is hard to pick up through the sources, but the fate of there are many of them in the Middle Ages, and they need their own. There are these things called legal additions. So because lots of people share the same surname and forename, you need a kind of job title or a status. That's what a kind of legal addition is. And they, in the 14th and 15th centuries, the addition single woman comes into English to kind of say, look, and then you're right, they're not having the greatest time of it economically. They are kept at the kind of low paid, generally the kind of edges of the economy. It's kind of labor that you can get cheap, but they are certainly there because they need a legal addition to kind of say they exist. And what we then can't easily find our way back to is the kind of the inner thoughts of a resistance. I think there are writers, and this is where kind of poetry and fiction and all sorts of things can help, because it in that kind of, if only slightly or kind of made up space of kind of literature, you can sometimes find things that are kind of bit outside of where the kind of bulk of society has kind of got to at any point. But I think for all of the words I look at, from many of the words, even the words that we think should be, and which are part of the kind of long-standing, I mean, by male gaze, I think you mean sort of all of the ways in which women and their lives are being kind of ideologically constructed at these points in history, the kind of assumptions that society is handing out. But generally there are challenges somewhere at that historical moment to that. So I think these things are always shown to be on quite unsteady foundations. But then of course we know that those the kind of legal and social and religious structures that are kind of holding this stuff in place are really very hard to shift and take a long time to shift. But I think it doesn't mean that we shouldn't look back for the kind of insights that are reached earlier and earlier on, even, and that tells us something. Even if society is thinking one way about something, there are always people within it with a different point of view.
Yeah, and I love that the words themselves can sort of be these little kernels, these little precursors, these little nuggets of insight that show a trajectory, that show a mentality of an era. It's very easy to make, I think, to paint history with a broad brush and to say, well, because this is how documentation reads, this is what everybody believed and thought. But of course, we know that history is written by the people in power. And it's and although we have examples of history that's written by women, it's, our perspectives were the minority perspectives.
But so, for example, if you look at kind of census and parish records and things like that, yes, women are not very often given job titles, for example, and they're labelled as kind of wife or maid. And we think, yes, maybe they're having very, very limited lives. But some brilliant historians have done work looking at court cases, say, where women end up having to kind of testify when something has happened, a death or a crime. And they've looked at what women describe themselves as doing at those moments. What were you doing when you then saw this terrible thing happen? And they show that even though the nouns, the job titles, don't often get given to women in certain sorts of records, in the doing, the verbs, they are doing lots of things in the kind of broader economy, say lots of quite physical work, sometimes quite technical work. So sometimes it's a question of which words we're looking at. Yes, there are not many women officially listed as doing these things in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or a bit later. But if we find a set of records that can let us see who's doing what, you can get a picture that suggests that women are doing lots of things in the past. So it's interesting to think about kind of what sorts of records and what sort of words are the right places to look, to kind of perhaps see that, some of those later ideas of women, the angel in the house, and women, the model of femininity that we think might have applied all the way through is not really there necessarily. There are young women powering cranes to build harbors. Women are expected to do, that I don't think I don't write very much in the book about those kind of later models of femininity, because I'm not very interested in
Right.
femininity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not on a personal level, not on a kind of social level, but there are other, working women, the work of care, all sorts of things like that you can find a set of vocabulary that will kind of tell you some interesting things.
I love that. Like sort of these like crane operators. It's surprising yet not at all surprising to me. And so
Well,
I'm just curious.
They're
Oh, go
providing
ahead.
the power. They're in the treadmill because they're young,
Oh,
fit, strong things. Why wouldn't you put them in the treadmill? I mean,
right,
my daughter would be
exactly.
great. You just kind of set her going. She'd go for hours.
And so, that sort of leads me to what I think could be a closing question here for this lovely conversation that, gosh, could just keep going and going, which is, was there anything in your research for this book that you came across that like truly surprised you? You've been kind of steeped in this type of literature for your career. So did you come across anything in your research where you were like, wow, I did not expect that?
I think I was surprised by how the most simple words could have the most interesting histories. So a word like girl, that seems like the most obvious, boy and girl. No, so girl doesn't come into English till the middle of the Middle Ages, so it's kind of quite late when you look at it from my perspective. And it first of all means both male and female children. So you can have references to knave girls, which sounds a bit kind of strange, boy girls, and you think, what's going on? And then it's only used to mean female children in the way that we often use it now at the beginning of the 16th century. But the work of a historian like Jennifer Higginbotham has shown that for its first sort of century and a bit, when it's used in that way to specify a female child or a young woman, it's often used when that girl or young woman is acting in some way out of kind of society's normal conventions. She's not being a maid or a daughter or whatever. She's being a girl. And I was so surprised that, and then it kind of settles down, but that even a word that's as kind of familiar and everyday as girl has a phase where it's a kind of new word, and it's perhaps almost kind of capturing a new idea that there are young women and girls. You can think of kind of rebellious young women in Shakespeare, say that there are women kind of standing up a little bit, not, there are limits to what they can achieve, but kind of resisting fathers or kind of families, and they need a word like girl. So I was sort of completely delighted every time that I kind of, the familiar became strange and kind of able to kind of show that nothing is ever quite as straightforward as we would think, which I think is the process of being this kind of person who studies the kind of old stuff of the past, that you're trying to kind of let it speak to you and not kind of impose your ideas on it. So yeah, I think the things that I found most surprising were the things that I thought would be very familiar and straightforward.
Right, the ones that sort of challenge our frame, that we're looking at the past through the eyes of the present, and kind of I think there's always that implicit assumption that everything was leading up to today, kind of like I mentioned before. But ultimately, like you said, things always have a nucleation point, and that cross section of time was not necessarily in service to today, and so sort of seeing it for what it was and trying our best, at least, to, I guess, bracket our assumptions. It's not always easy to do, but it's probably so deeply important for a scholar like yourself.
Yes, I'm going to go away and ask my daughter, who's very interested and very good at science, what a nucleation point is, and she'll explain it to me, because I don't know.
I love it. Well, gosh, there are a million other questions that I could have for you, but I've already kept you for over an hour. And so I just want to take a moment now to thank you so much, Jenni, for spending your time with us today, for doing this incredible scholarship, and for sharing your insights with us.
Thanks. It's been great to have the conversation.
And everybody, the book is Mother Tongue, The Surprising History of Women's Words, by Dr. Jenni Nuttall. Did I say that okay? Nuttall?
Nuttall. Yeah,
damn it! I tried to give it like a little lilt. By Dr. Jenni Nuttall.
I had no idea it was so unpronounceable.
Thank you for spending your time with us. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.